of the Galilee, Nakab in the south, Haifa, the southern Hebron hills, the hills around Nablus and Jenin, the Jordan Valley, Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. Wherever you look, the same priorities are at work, which are policies designed to ensure that one group of people dominates another group of people. And that's the Palestinian experience, whether they've got citizenship or whether they're in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Oren Yiftachel, an Israeli professor, put it in this way a few years ago. He talked about how, quote, the colonized West Bank, the besieged Gaza Strip, and Israel proper, each with its own official set of rules, are merging into one regime system ultimately controlled by the Jewish state. He's talking about the emergence of a de facto one-state reality where the state of Israel controls everything, the land and the people, who are located between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and where it implements in that area a regime of privilege for one group at the expense of another group. The only thing I would change in that quote, and for all I know he might as well because this was a few years ago, change the tense of the word merging into merged. I would say that is what has happened, and that is what you find there on the ground today. Another way of thinking about it, 1 in 7 Palestinians are second-class citizens, a third of Palestinians live under military occupation, and half, or just over half of Palestinians are excluded from the country altogether. Here's a panel, a sequence of maps, which is probably similar to something you might have seen before. And this shows, over a period of time, Jewish/state land ownership. Okay? The one on the left is 1917, okay, showing Jewish land ownership in Palestine in 1917. The next one across is 1947. It's obviously a lot grown, but it's 1 year before the state's established. Then next across is 1960. So the state of Israel has been established. A large area is now obviously like on the map colored black because most of the land in the state is controlled by the state. And then finally, on the far right hand side, it's basically today, okay, where bits of the West Bank are now also been eaten up as well. And here is a different panel of maps to show another kind of idea, which is like the various privileges or not of access. Okay, so on the left-hand side, the area that's colored in black is the area that you're able to go to with Israeli citizenship. Okay, the area is open to Israeli citizenship. Next along, it's your area, the area of access Palestinians with West Bank ID. Next along, it's Palestinians with Gaza Strip ID. And the one on the right-hand side, which is blank, i.e. nowhere, is expelled Palestinian refugees. 2 pictures, you couldn't tell which one was taken from inside the West Bank and inside so-called pre-67 Israel. Okay? Because the same thing is happening in both places. Demolition of Palestinian property, while at the same time, alongside, or in some cases, in the future on top of, Jewish communities are planned and grow. One on the left is from the Jordan Valley, one on the right is from the Negev. So I'm talking about rethinking. Rethinking to have an approach to the situation that is based on the reality on the ground. Not on what it was like 10 or 20 years ago, not on what some people would like us to think the reality is, but actually what is happening right now as documented extensively by various organizations, and also an approach that's based on the failure of the peace process. Now, to describe the peace process as a failure is somewhat a generous concession to the peace process, because you might very well argue that the whole point of the so-called official peace process was to produce a permanent process and no real peace, at least not a peace with justice at its center. But let's just assume that the peace process was meant to bring peace. It's failed because we're talking 20 years later within the Oslo framework, and Israeli colonization has continued apace, announcements occur of settlement construction all the time, Palestinians are still killed with impunity, etc., etc. Rethink also in order to move beyond occupation discourse. And it's easier to explain what I don't mean as a way of explaining what I do. What I don't mean is that we shouldn't have a focus in terms of education or activism on what is happening for Palestinians where Israeli apartheid is at its most brutal and existential, like in the Gaza Strip or in the communities threatened with destruction in the southern Hebron Hills, etc. But what I do mean is that we should put those cases and those examples in a wider context and remember that they are one part of a bigger picture and a bigger system. We also need to rethink the orthodoxy about Israel's democratic credentials, which should be at least, you would hope it would be obvious to rethink that, even based on the non-comprehensive contents of this presentation. But as we do all of that rethinking, what we will also have to do, and already do of course, is resist attempts to fence off and to make taboo a debate about Israel's so-called right to be a Jewish state. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. In the UK, in Britain, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, a couple of years ago, I think probably was now, he went and sort of said in public that Israeli settlements in the West Bank are an act of vandalism. Okay? He deliberately choose to use quite strong language. I'm sure all of your elected representatives on Capitol Hill use that kind of language all the time, right? And anyway, he used that language about settlements, and there wasn't like a big controversy, right? Like it was reported a little bit in the media, but it wasn't a big deal. He's not going to face, he didn't face any consequences about that. So in other words, within the UK, there is now a kind of a space for critique about aspects of Israeli policies, like settlements, like some of the military attacks, etc. But you won't find Nick Clegg, or a politician of his sort of position, going on TV or in the media and saying something along the lines of, well, you know what, I think we have to ask some serious questions about what Israel's definition of identity as a Jewish state means for the Palestinians. Okay, because that is still considered to be an area that is off limits by many people. And of course, when you take it to that level, when you take the focus for that discussion, you get the usual kinds of smears and attacks being used that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and I myself am not too unfamiliar with. Now, after all of that rethinking, you also get to then do reimagining, which is a more positive sort of act, as it were. Reimagining a future genuine coexistence of equals. Unfortunately, there are some people, both there and here, who take a concept or a word like coexistence and abuse and misuse it in order to perpetuate the colonial status quo. Okay, in order to make the colonizer feel better about him or herself. Coexistence, of course, is a good thing, but it can only really take place in a meaningful sense when you're talking about it between two equals. It also means reimagining the understanding of self-determination so that you're talking about two groups of people sharing the same land with equality. Reimagining means that you're putting the focus on things like decolonization and democratization. And reimagining means, instead of can we return, or when will we return, Palestinian refugees get to ask, what kind of return do we want to create for ourselves? I'm going to finish now. These are the words of one of the first members of Knesset, whose son became more famous than him, member of Knesset Shmuel Dayan, in 1950. He said this: maybe not allowing the refugees back is not right and not moral, but if we become just and moral, I do not know where we will end up. And I think there is an answer to that in 2013, that instead of being an answer of guns and walls and fear and defiance, can actually be one of hope as well. And I'll finish with the words that I finished my second book with by the late great Edward Said, and he wrote this: coexistence, sharing and community must win out over exclusivism, intransigence and rejectionism. And the only thing I would add is that there is no time to lose. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. My question to you is this, and you can respond. When Ahmadinejad reportedly downplayed the Holocaust, and when he threatened to wipe Israel off the map, you've been reported as both times coming to his defense and saying, well, he didn't really say it that way. You've also been quoted as saying, well, even though I'm not anti-Semitic myself, I can understand why some people are. Now, I don't know, I can only imagine the reaction you would get in the United States here if someone were to make that same statement about Hispanic Americans or Black Americans, because they would lose all support and credibility. And yet, why is it that you get a pass from your followers on that, And that why shouldn't I, as a Gentile, suspect that this whole conflict is not so much about land as it is about religion?
That's the question. I'm not going to make it about me, because actually the answers to the questions you seek are already online, although maybe not on the websites or emails that you read from to make the question. So you can find my answers for all of those issues. It's repeated many times in my own writing, in my books and my articles, my position against anti-Semitism, the fact that it is vital to oppose anti-Semitism as a form of racism like any other, and in fact it's precisely opposition to all kinds of racism that informs my own opposition to Israeli apartheid. I'm not going to discuss any of those other specifics further because they're actually all online if you've looked any further than the normal smear sites. And in fact, the people who use that kind of stuff are simply trying to shoot the messenger and distract attention from what's really happening.
That's not an answer. That's a non-answer.
When you went to Israel and Palestine, did you find many Israelis who were really objecting to